Hello and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a podcast brought to you by Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing and the book industry. I'm Sam Shinta, publisher of Fulcrum Publishing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kateri Kramer, Fulcrum's marketing director. Hi, Kateri, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I was gonna do this podcast outside on the patio, but then it started thunderstorming. And I thought that would be a lot of noise for Kelly to try to extract from the podcast. So I'm back inside, but it's been gloomy here for like days now. This is the longest stretch of consistent rain that I remember us having in a long time.
Well, at least you're having rain that can wash the air a little bit. Here, we're getting the smoke from the Alberta fires. And so everything is hazy and you can just see a lot. And I mean, everyone's coughing, their eyes are itching. It's just, it seems like we are right in the direct wind path of this throughout the state. So
that's crazy.
As I know our guests will attest to as well, because we were actually talking about it before we got started. But a wonderful show today. We actually have two guests with us today, recent authors of Planting an Idea, a new book but from Fulcrum Publishing. Jerry Apps is a former county extension agent and a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is now a full-time writer and rural historian with a focus on rural history, country life, and the environment. He has authored, get this, over 50 books. I consider Jerry the dean of Wisconsin authors. There is just nobody more prolific or well-known in this region in terms of writing about the state. He has won multiple awards for his writing, and he created documentaries with PBS Wisconsin about rural life and his upbringing. Jerry and his wife, Ruth, have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandsons, and they divide their time between their home in Madison and their farm, Waushara, in Waushara County, Wisconsin. Natasha Kassulke is a former journalist for the Wisconsin State Journal and a former editor of the Wisconsin Natural Resources magazine. She now directs communications for the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and teaches journalism part-time at Madison College. Natasha resides in Madison, Wisconsin with her husband, Steve Apps. Note the same last name as Jerry Apps. Natasha and Jerry are related. So they pulled together this wonderful new book, Planting an Idea, which talks all about using critical and creative thinking to deal with issues in the environment. And so, Jerry and Natasha, welcome. It is great to see both of you.
It's good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So this new book, Planting an Idea, which was your first collaboration, what motivated you to do this book? What sparked the interest in doing this particular book?
Well, for me, it goes back a long time. I have been interested in environmental issues for a very long time. In fact, way back in high school, I happened to find this the other day. I had written what was called an original oration, and it was titled "The Hole in Uncle Sam's Pocket," and was all about soil conservation. And I wrote and gave that speech in 1950. That is a long time ago. So the environmental concerns have been with me for a long time. The second concern I have had, and that's developed in recent years, I'm concerned that people are not thinking for themselves these days to the extent that I believe they ought. And the major issues that we face in this country, including the environmental issues, require considerable original thinking, not the thinking of just a few, not the thinking that, well, Joe believes this, therefore that sounds close to what I can do, and I don't have time to think about this stuff, so that's fine with me. That attitude troubles me a great deal. And one of the reasons that Natasha and I, by the way, she's my daughter-in-law, that we wrote the book is to help people first recognize that they have a right to think for themselves, and they have an obligation to do it. And then we offer some tips on how to do it. So I'll stop with that and have Natasha add whatever she would like.
Thanks, Jerry, for that transparency. Yeah, this is my first book, so it's an exciting opportunity for me to work with Jerry and learn from him. He's just a renowned storyteller and historian and has a lot to teach. I've read so many of his books, but I've never gone through the process of actually putting a book together. And so that was just really an honor, and it allowed us to spend time together and, kind of explore some of the things we get together and talk about when we are done planting the garden or after a family meal, some of the questions and concerns we have. One reason I'm really interested in having people read this book is I've been hearing a lot of hopelessness where people just feel overwhelmed. They think, especially in, environmental issues through COVID, there's nothing I can do about it. And Jerry and I talked about, we think there's actually a lot that people can do, and to base their actions and opinions on facts and finding good information. And so a big part of the book and the message here is to help people think for themselves and find good sources of information, and then move to action, and that we can all do something, even if it's a little piece of our world that we can do to try to do something for, the next generations and leave this a better place. So, for me, it's having this great opportunity to get to spend more time with my father-in-law and learn from a great teacher. But it's also, I'm hopeful that people of many generations, different age groups, we're of different generations, can find something here, some kind of action, and feel hopeful.
I love that you talk about hope and optimism, but obviously that's built on trying to get people to understand these problems in a critical way and to try and combat some of that misinformation. What are some of the examples? What would you say would be some of the kind of the most prominent examples of maybe misunderstanding or misinformation that are out there on environmental issues, or where people get sidetracked?
Why don't you go with that, Natasha?
Well, I think we're still, for some reason, we have people in denial of climate change and that global warming. We see these extreme weather impacts and devastation and loss of life, and we still have people who deny this is a problem, or that humans have impacted our climate. And we're kind of at a tipping point, and so that greatly concerns me. Also, I'm very concerned when I hear people, when they're thinking about decisions about their own health and their well-being, that they are making decisions on misinformation, that they are trying things that are not approved, that are not safe for them, and contributing to what we call like a herd mentality. And so social media is something that I teach. I have a great interest in. I'm also very concerned about how it's being used to share misinformation. And so helping people recognize. So we have things like climate change, we have health issues. I think, Jerry can speak to agriculture, but PFAS, we have forever chemicals and plastics. And I think sometimes people think if I don't see it, if it's not happening in my community, it's not really happening. But Jerry and I point out in the book, oftentimes people who are most impacted by some of these environmental issues are not the people contributing to it. And so those are a couple of the examples that I wrote about in my book: biodiversity, loss of species diversity, and genetics.
And other issues, there are several of them, of course, that we talk about in the book. But water is a major issue that we really take for granted. And only in the recent couple of years, and with California is a great example, where they were drying up and now they're flooding. And that's, of course, a ramification of climate change, but it also speaks to the fact that we've got to be concerned about water, and to think about when the Arctic ice is melting and the oceans are rising. And what are the ramifications of that? Well, they are many. especially if you happen to be living on a coastal area somewhere or on an island. And there are examples of islands being flooded and people having to move. So all of that requires, in my mind, attention by not just a handful of environmentalists, but all of us. The issues that we talk about are everybody's issue, not just a select few. And that's a difficult point to get across, because when we talk about the need to, number one, look for factual information, and here are some tips for discerning what is truth and what is not. It's a big problem today. But then also encouraging people to be creative, to think about approaches to solutions that nobody has thought about before, to look at water and say, well, what are the possible ways by which we can conserve water and look at water as something that, and it is essential to life itself. How can we get that across? Because it is so taken for granted. Turn the faucet and the water runs. I could go on at length about that, but those are some of the concerns that I have.
Right. And we talk a lot about so energy and clean energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of concerns about species diversity. We've talked about, well, what good is a bee, or what good is a mosquito? We consider them pests, right? But we talk about pollinators, and we all want to eat, trying to find common ground, right? We all need to eat. And so the importance of pollinators. And I think, when Jerry's talking about things like water, where we live, it's plentiful, and we do probably take it for granted. But if you're in a place experiencing a drought or flooding, it's a real serious concern. Likewise, if you live in a community that needs jobs, and so you're concerned about,
Mm-hmm.
how you're going to support your family. And I think there's some people who hold an opinion that you can't protect the environment and have jobs. And so we offer examples where you can have both, and clean energy offers opportunities for some new and really interesting job opportunities that maybe didn't exist, 10, 20 years ago.
And
you mentioned, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Jerry.
I was just going to add, one of the very major concerns that I have, and I'm an old farm boy, and I have seen the revolution in farming take place. And this may sound extreme. We all need to eat, of course, we know that. But I believe that agriculture in this country, and I will be criticized for saying this because I'm an old professor of agriculture, agriculture has lost its way. We need to examine it. We need to look at where our food comes from and what takes place in the creation of that food. We need to look at the use of insecticides and pesticides and genetic manipulation and all that sort of thing, some of which is necessary, some of which is important. One of my concerns, and I have many, is so often when we come up with something in the laboratory that really works well, let me use DDT as an example. It worked so well. Oh my gosh, it killed flies, it killed mosquitoes, it helped eliminate malaria, and it also killed the eagles and the other raptors. The side effects of technology, they must be considered. We need people educated beyond the narrow to be able to see the breadth, the sociology, the philosophy, the, if I might say it, the spiritual dimensions of what we are doing. And so I'm encouraged by reading Native American material and what they have done without bragging about it, what they have done to assure that what is being done today will have a positive effect on 7 generations from now. So often our concern is the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And the Native American strategy is what about 7 generations from now? That's a whole new way of thinking.
Well, yeah, it's that wonderful stewardship idea, right? This notion that we have a responsibility to today and tomorrow, while also linking us to the past and what has happened in the past.
Exactly.
Well, and one of the things, and what I was going to ask, and you just jumped, you hit it already, is one of the things I really admire about this book is the way that you broaden the environmental conversation to bring in topics like land use or agriculture practices, right? So typically you don't see those covered in environmental texts, or at least in general overviews, but bringing this as a kind of central point to talking about our land, our environment, our air, our water, all will, of course, then center on things like land use and agriculture use.
I think a lot of communities are struggling with, these land use discussions right now, and they're thinking of smart growth or having, more public mass transportation, those kinds of options. We saw people moving to the suburbs and then people coming back to the city, and farmland, loss of the family farm. And so I think land use is really very high up the list and concerns in terms of community development across the United States.
And the word sustainability has taken on political dimensions that almost all of what we're talking about should not, in my biased judgment, should not be a political issue. It should be an issue that all of us are concerned about, no matter what our religion, our politics, our educational background, where we live. These are issues that we must look at together and not politicize them or do all the other divisive things that are going on these days.
I'm wondering if you both can talk a little bit about maybe some ideas or ways to get youth involved. And I'm thinking, like, yes, high schoolers, but even younger than that, and making very young children care about the environment and the earth in a way that makes them continue that process as they become adults who have like an impact in the political system or their communities or that kind of thing.
To me, one of the most interesting ways of doing that is through gardening. Such a simple idea, but here in Madison, a number of the schools have school gardens where elementary and secondary kids have a chance to see where a carrot comes from, where a radish comes from, where a potato comes from, and be a part of growing those crops. I've gardened since I was a little kid, and Natasha's a wonderful gardener. We have a big garden at our farm today, but it is such a subtle way of helping kids not only learn something about where their food comes from, but to learn about the relationship to nature, because when you're working in a garden, you are working in nature. You are creating something that in many ways, when you plant that tiny little seed, it's a miracle to see what happens when the tiny little seed becomes a 5-foot tall tomato plant. Oh my gosh, why did that happen? How did that happen? Why is it important that that happen? What prevents that from happening? All of those kinds of questions result from gardening. So to me, that's one of the very practical, easy things for introducing young people to nature, to food, to all of to many of the questions that we're talking about today.
And in terms of gardening, you don't have to have a large space. So we talk about container gardens, windowsill gardens. There's, you could do this if you live in an apartment. There's opportunities for that. I like to, one of the things I miss most about being young is the opportunity to play, having more time to play and just get outdoors. And I know that can be hard in some communities that may not have a lot of green space or a wealth of parks. I think the schools have a role in this. Jerry mentioned school gardens. Some schools have forest. They work with the communities that will sponsor a school forest. So I think those are wonderful. I love museums. I just really, we have a great geology museum, and I'm married to a photographer, and I'm not going to lie, when he is out and gets down and close to the ground with his phone, he gets amazing photos of critters, and just sees things at a different, like a micro level that we miss out on, right, when we're walking too fast. And so, I would get them interested in photography and slowing down and taking pictures, or and a big part of our book is being creative and art. And maybe having them, giving them a prompt and allowing them to start journaling or to draw, to do puzzles and things that work their brains, but also work their artistic muscles, I think is important too. But I just, I think adults have a lot to learn from young people, and finding joy and playing and getting outside, and, take a kid fishing. So, I know they like their computers, but maybe you just offer a day a timeout where, we're going outside and we're not turning the computer on today.
Here's another practical thing that I've observed. We have 2 ponds at our farm, and I have worked with an environmental teacher from Oshkosh who brings over a busload of kids. And they walked, the pond is about, I don't know, a quarter of a mile from where the bus would stop, and they marched down to the pond. And then he has one rule. He says, find a place to sit down, put your phone away, and be quiet. And for half an hour, which seems like an eternity if you're waiting for your phone to do something about it, but for half an hour, sit quietly. And then he asks them, write down what happened as you listened, smelled, felt, etc. And the words that come out are fantastic. What these kids write, because no one, I would guess, in recent time for them, has asked them to sit down and just don't talk, just pay attention to what's going on around you. Second point I would make, for 25 years, I have canoed in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota, wilderness canoeing, I call it. And when we go there, you don't have to tell people to turn off your cell phone, because there's no cell phone connections there. They don't work. And the idea of sitting by a lake in northern Minnesota at night and listening to the call of a loon in the distance, and then silence. And we're sitting by a little campfire and smelling a little smoke, and just immersing ourselves in nature. This sounds corny, but I suggest sometimes we need to develop a feeling of being one with nature, because we as human beings are not apart from it. Genetically, we're not apart from it. We are a part of nature. And we need to help young people as well as oldsters recognize that being a part of something means learning something about it. Not only learning its name, but learning its characteristics, learning its history, learning what feelings it generates in you when you hear it and see it and perhaps feel it. Those are some of the things I feel strongly about.
Well, and I think that's great. Like there's a school close to me. It's elementary, middle, and high school. So they're pretty comprehensive, but it's an expeditionary learning school. And it's very project-based. And every single senior goes to the boundary waters every year. And they've been kind of brought up in this practice of like being alone in nature. When they're freshmen, they go on a backpacking trip and they have to spend one night alone. At the boundary waters, I think they spend an entire week alone. And then there's a teacher that goes around and checks on them once a day, make sure everything is fine. But they're like completely solitary for many, many days. And those are the students that I have like lots of hope for changing our climate situation. And I think that every school should be structured in an expeditionary or project-based way moving forward, because that's how we're going to change the way that we interact with the world and other people and the environment. So yeah, I think that everything that you guys are saying is really important for the teachers in those types of schools, or in schools that have the opportunity to do things like that, where they can go forest bathing, they can have a garden or a greenhouse in the schoolyard, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's really cool.
Another point, Madison has a school forest. My daughter is a second grade teacher here in Madison, and she takes her second graders on field trips to the school forest. And you know what their biggest concerns are? Are there lions in there? Are there tigers in there? Because they've never, I don't know why this is happening, but they've never been in a forest of any kind, and they're scared to death of what's not there. They should be worried about wood ticks, to tell the truth.
So Natasha, you obviously, you've been a journalist, you teach journalism. What does the role of journalists play in this whole thing of better critical thinking and better information? I know this is something that's been talked about quite a bit, but is there a role? Is there a space here, and can they be stronger advocates? What happens here, or how can we be better?
Thank you for asking that. I have very strong feelings about this indeed. For one thing, we are seeing journalism changing, and I'm heartened by, I still have a lot of students who want to be journalists because they want to do the right thing. They want to help people who don't have a voice. They want to tell these stories, and they understand that we need to find the truth and have good sources of information. Unfortunately, they're concerned about jobs, right? And so a lot of newsrooms, as they've cut staff, they've cut, for example, their environmental journalists, their science reporter. So I think there's a challenge in making science communications maybe have a bigger role in general for students, whether they're going into journalism or a health field, to learn how to better communicate with the public and to use language that resonates with the public and makes it accessible. I'm also really interested in finding diversity of voices. I think sometimes journalists are, they're challenged to get the story first, and they go back to the same sources over and over again, and that we should look for more diverse voices. Science, environmental topics can be very complex. They're very difficult to adequately explain in a 300-word story. And so I think offering opportunities, for example, podcasts, to run interviews in a longer format that people can listen to, would be really helpful. And if someone's getting really excited about a topic, that they can spend more time with it and go a little bit deeper. So I think journalists have a very strong role to play, I think, in finding diverse voices, offering different platforms. And I think we need to have more journalists who know a little bit more about how to communicate with the public in a scientific, complex way, to better explain that. So I'm really excited that podcasts have become very popular, and I think video storytelling is another avenue that can work. And so I don't think journalism is going away. I think it's changing, and I know a lot of young people are still really interested in helping people have a voice, and I'm interested in advocacy as well. And so when I went to journalism school, you were objective, you stayed out of the way of the story, and now we're seeing more and more advocacy journalism, and I'm kind of excited about that, where journalists are expressing some opinions and having a role. And advocating to do the right thing.
So obviously your book centers on the environmental issues, but in a broader sense, and again, this is what makes it such a wonderful and I think in many ways a unique book, is this notion of bringing critical and creative thinking and training for that, and then using the environmental issues as a platform to practice this stuff. What are a couple of tips, without giving away the book, because of obviously we want everybody to go out and buy the book, but what are a couple of things that people could do generally to be better critical thinkers when they come across stories concerning environmental issues?
Well, there's several things I could mention. One thing is slow down. Realize that everything you can't spend 1 minute reading something and think that you got the answer. And that's one of the reasons I write books, is that I expect people to spend more time than just a couple of minutes. So look at something in depth. Look at something that, that you spend some time looking at it. And then as you read, constantly question. This is where the critical thinking comes in. What's the evidence for what this author is suggesting? What is the evidence? Is that evidence legitimate? Is it evidence that is true, is factual? And we in the book have some suggestions on how to do that. And then when you look at that material, how does that affect me? Because most of these things do affect the person. And what changes might I make in my own thinking and in my actions as I consider what I'm reading about? For some 30 years, this is the sort of thing I taught at the university, helping people get in touch with themselves and their beliefs and values, and realizing that how you were brought up and where you were brought up and when you were brought up has a tremendous influence on who you are today. And I worked with my students to help them dig out that information. What do you believe about the nature of human beings? That's one of the, sounds kind of academic, but it's one of the foundational things to look at. And what do you believe about change and how it occurs? And what change should not occur? Not every change is good. Not every piece of technology is good. We have this thing about, oh, there's a new version of my whatever coming along and I must jump on it. Well, look at it critically. Think about it. Consider, is this really something that has evidence-based, is going to make a difference, etc.? I could go on at length with those ideas.
Right. I agree. We need to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, how do we know what we know? Why do we believe what we believe? And be open to being wrong. That we, Jerry and I, in the book too, we challenge people. We are getting duped. We are getting taken advantage of. People are misleading us intentionally. We deserve better. We're smarter than that. And I think we need to practice some of the strategies we offer in the book. And, we're not going to be a part of sharing, this misinformation. And I also think thinking of motivation is very important, or where someone is when you come to a conversation with them about some of these topics. And you're right, Sam, it could be environmental, but it could be politics. Think of all the different topics when you get together with, your family at a holiday or something, the variety of topics you cover. I think this book has ways for you to better communicate and have conversations and find a starting point. And so I'm always interested in, what's motivating you? What is your goal here? And is it, in journalists, we say, follow the money. But we're interested in people and their faith and their backgrounds and diversity in their cultures and different experiences. And I think that goes way beyond an environmental issue. These can be applied across the board, the curriculum.
Yeah, I think it's very helpful for people across all walks of life to have those skills and develop them from a young age. My last question is unrelated to the book and to critical thinking. I want to know what's in your garden this year.
Natasha?
Well, so far we've got it's a long list. I won't give you everything, but we've got the tomatoes and the onions. We have the cold weather crops. And so radishes, peas. But we do corn. One thing that's gotten us really excited the last few years has been thinking of our pollinator friends and trying to plant a variety of flowers. Not only are they beautiful, but it's attracting pollinators. And so we've got sunflowers and just a variety of flowers that will be enticing, and they're so pretty, and we are just sort of getting going this year. It's been a little slow. It's been a rough spring here. We've had
it has here too.
Weather issues. And
Yeah.
so, we're working now on our cool weather crops. And then I'm really excited about the diversity of flowers we're planting this year.
That'll be nice. That'll be really good.
And one interesting thing has happened about 2 years ago. Our neighbor across the road bought a couple of hives of honeybees.
Oh, cool.
And we have always grown cucumbers and squash and pumpkins. And as the years went on, I noticed, we all noticed, the yields just began plummeting. Why? Because there was no pollinators. And now with the honeybees just a stone's throw away, that's changing. So it's a vivid example of as Natasha points out, a vivid example of the importance of pollinators. We're learning. I've been gardening forever, and each year it's learned something new.
Well, and if people haven't already read Natasha's blog about No Mow May, they should go on to our website and read about it. I haven't mowed my lawn this May, and I'm waiting because I've got lots of little pollinator snacks everywhere. We might even push it even a little bit further because all of our perennials died this summer or in the winter because it was such a cold winter. So all of our spring stuff that's normally up by now is dead. So we don't have a ton of other stuff available until it gets a little bit warmer consistently. So if you haven't read it, go check it out on the blog.
Well, Colorado has some interesting challenges for gardening. One of my sons lives up in the mountains.
Nice.
Lives in Avon. And his home is at 8,500 feet. And gardening at 8,500 feet is even more challenging than at 5,000 feet.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, they're just not only the temperatures and stuff, but they're getting the wildfires every single year. And that's affecting pollinators and really everything. So it's tough up that high.
Well, I had one more question before we get to the book recommendations. Natasha, I heard a rumor that you were named after a cartoon featuring a certain moose and his squirrel friend. Is there a truth to this rumor?
There is. So people assume I'm Russian because of my name, and I am. And people will come up to me and speak Russian, and I'm sorry I haven't invested the time to learn Russian yet. But my mother was a big fan of Rocky and Bullwinkle. And so I am named for Natasha, the villainess in Rocky and Bullwinkle. And Sam, I am so thankful she did not name my brother Boris. So
well, all I can say is kill moose.
Right. Girl, yes.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, both of you. Now we get to our wonderful segment where we talk about recommendations for books. And this time, in honor of the book that you've written, we are looking for recommendations of books that you think are particularly effective at teaching critical and or creative thinking skills, besides yours, of course. So books that are particularly effective at teaching critical and or creative thinking skills. So why don't we start with you, Jerry?
Well, I'm cheating, of course, because I'm going to the for further reading in the back of our book, where you list all of these. But here, I'll just mention a couple of them. And one is Critical Thinking Skills for Dummies by Martin Cohen, Cohen. That's one. The Art of Thinking by Ernest Dimmet, Dimmet. Jonathan Haber, Critical Thinking. And one foundational one, How to Think by Ellen Jacobs. I've had and I'm sure Natasha did as well, wonderful time going back and reading all of this material, much of which I had been using over the years in my classes. But then I'll mention one other one, the Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking. Well, what about that? And then one last one, which I think is just a great book, and it has a wonderful title, A Whack on the Side of the Head, which is all about creative thinking. And Roger Van Oech, A Whack on the Side of the Head. Sometimes all of us need that, I think. A little whack on the side of the head, get things going.
How about you, Natasha? You have anything to add?
I have just a couple. We did do a lot of research, so I would encourage people to take a look at that part of the book for additional reading. I'm going to give Jerry some props here. He has Telling Your Story, Fulcrum, and also More Than Words, a memoir of a writing life. That is a newer book by Jerry, and he talks about his process for storytelling in these books, and they both involve critical and creative thinking. And they're just wonderful. You get to learn a little bit more about Jerry and his experience as a teacher. So there's a lot to take away from there. And then I recommended Adam Grant, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And I think that's really important to figure out what we don't know and to become lifelong learners. And then I think, again, we've talked about getting outside and reading the environment, right? It's an open book out there. So, but I learned a lot reading Jerry's books over the years and then going through this process. So I hope people will learn a lot from reading our book as well.
What were your books, Sam?
Sorry, I was saying, how about you, Kateri? But yeah, I was muted, so I guess I'll go first.
Yeah, you go first this time.
I've got one general recommendation and one book recommendation. So and as you know, I teach political theory, I teach American government, and so a lot of this is framed in that. And so students ask me oftentimes about stuff like this. We also did some critical thinking programs in high schools for a number of years. The first thing I always tell people is I just encourage them to read broadly when they're consuming news. So don't just get all of your news from one source. Try to be an omnivore of news material. So try and get out there. And, if you're typically an X viewer or an X reader, well, also read Y or watch Y, and be sure to be doing that, because you'll find some balance in doing that. So I think that's really important. But probably the foundational text for me, and one of the foundational texts in my life, is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, his essay on the essence of liberty, and in particular his chapter 2 on the liberty of thought and discussion, which talks about his idea of a marketplace of ideas, but he frames this really in the notion of critical thinking. He's got this wonderful quote in here that sounds a lot about like some of the things we've been talking about today. Mill says, "No one can be a great thinker who does not recognize that as a thinker, it is his first duty to follow his intellect to whatever conclusions it may lead. Truth gains more even by the errors of one who, with due study and preparation, thinks for himself, than by the true opinions of those who only hold them because they do not suffer themselves to think." So the idea is, be willing to challenge your ideas, be willing to consume information that forces you sometimes to think deeper, or to maybe say, oh golly, I hadn't thought about that position before, that angle before. And what you're doing, in effect, as Mill talks about, is you're honing that knife in the process, or you're sharpening that blade of your intellect when you're doing that. So that's what I would recommend. Read that and you'll be inspired.
Sam, I would add one thing to that, and that's wonderful what you just shared, is I used to ask my students is we would talk about particular points of view, and they would write papers on their point of view. And then I would ask them to write a paper on that topic from the opposing position. What don't you believe about this? And use evidence to support it so that and that's a real struggle for some people.
Oh, absolutely.
And I would push it and say, you've got to know what you don't believe as well as what you do believe. It's not enough to know what you believe. You got to know what you don't believe.
Well, I actually did that this past semester with some students. I did a night class. And one of the things we did was, in several of the sessions, we did a series of debates and deliberations. And I would give them the question. I break them into teams of 2. I'd give them the question, but not tell them what side they were on until we started. And so basically they had to prepare both sides. Even if they, really felt strongly about one, they had to be ready to argue one or the other. And it really did challenge them to think deeply about these issues and really read broadly about these issues. What about you, Kateri?
So I had a theme with my books. I picked books that I was given in my MFA on narrative nonfiction, because the idea of truth in narrative nonfiction is a little bit different than it is in journalistic nonfiction, because we have this issue of memory and what is true, what is not true versus accuracy, that kind of thing. So the first book is called Truth in Nonfiction. It's by David Lazar, who also happened to be my mentor in the MFA. And it's a collection of essays about this idea of truth, Montaigne's mantra of asking, what do I know, which is what everybody's been kind of talking about today, and figuring that out on the page, and how do we figure out what's true and what's not true in our essays. So that was my first one. And then the second one, which is a really fun book, is called The Lifespan of a Fact. And it's super interesting. The interior is formatted in a way in which the center section is the essay itself. And then John Diagata, the author, works with a guy named Jim, I think this is how you pronounce it, Jim Fingal, who's a fact checker. So he goes through every single aspect of John's essay. And then the external part of the book is all of these comments from Jim about what's true, what's not true. And it was brought on because John, one of his essays that was submitted to a magazine was declined because they said that they had fact checked certain parts of it and it wasn't true. So it's this meditation on truth versus accuracy and what the difference of those is in fact and fiction and that kind of thing. So
fascinating.
Truth stint.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, goodness, lots of great recommendations as always, and just a wonderful conversation today. I do want to thank both Jerry Apps and Natasha Kassulke for joining us and sharing with us the inspirational material about being better thinkers and more creative thinkers as we're facing these environmental challenges. The book, again, Planting an Idea, Critical and Creative Thinking About Environmental Problems, is available today in your local bookstores. We encourage you to check it out. It is great. It's one of those, another thing I love about this book, it's great for high school kids all the way to old timers. So anybody can pick this book up and learn something and be inspired and learn these techniques and then apply them broadly beyond just these environmental issues. So thank you, Jerry and Natasha, both for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.